Welcome everyone to today's Zoom presentation that's going to be given to us by Ruben Nelson today. Presentation I'm really looking forward to as a native Albertan. But Ruben is a Canadian pioneer of serious future thinking. He's a pioneer in this field. He's invested his life exploring, seeking, and to understand and respond to the forces that are now reshaping our lives, our world, and our future. He's Canada's leading researcher, practitioner, and teacher of the next generation of strategic foresight, the new cognitive work of whole systems governance and leadership. He's equally at home in the classroom, conference room, boardrooms, and church basements. He holds a BA honors from Queen's University and a TTH from Queen's Theological College. Over his varied career, he has taught at Queen's University and the University of Calgary, lived in India, and worked in Ottawa. Ruben is the executive director of Foresight Canada, and he lives in the Rocky Mountains of Alberta with his wife, Heather, his wife of 59 years, and their cats. And he has 2 adult children. Thank you. Over to you, Ruben.
Jean, thank you for that kind introduction. I'm delighted to be back with KCOR. I've been a member of KCOR for some time, and I admire it as one of Canada's oldest organizations that consistently raises issues that are important, truly important, to the future of this country and the future of this world. Today, I want to think with you as an Albertan about what's going on in Alberta and why it matters to other Canadians. I've spent most of my life in Alberta, but I lived for 31 years outside Alberta. So I know Alberta inside, in a sense, and out. And I want you to know that I've struggled to learn to see beyond the obvious in my lifetime. And I think we live at a time when, as things heat up, as tempers flare, as we get more exhausted, we need to really hold on to that capacity to learn to see new perspectives and to share them with others, because our perspective on the world does determine how we behave in it. And it's quite clear that as whole societies, our perspectives on the world are leading us to a path of destruction. This is the main burden of what I want to say to you. That there's a major storm brewing. An Alberta clipper, to use that phrase, will strike Ottawa and Eastern Canada late summer into fall 2021. So be prepared for attacks on Canada, our history, constitution, character, and future. While dressed up as a rational debate, it is highly emotional and manipulative. It's rooted in just enough facts to be credible, but beware of the paranoia, conspiracy theories, and covert power plays that are hidden in it. And to be fair to those who are behind the fuss, these are times that are extraordinary, that they're volatile, they're uncertain, they're complex and ambiguous, and that such times make these kind of messes possible. It's not in just an immediate sense that we're up against bad people. And so it's useful to think for just a minute about the times we're in, that most people are hard pressed and near exhaustion. COVID has added to that. The future we were promised is slipping away. That's clearly happening in Alberta as well as in the rest of the country. And Albertans are grieving the future that they thought they had. Also slipping away is a shared and agreed upon way of settling differences. We used to rely on the objective truth of the First Enlightenment, and it, bit by bit, is being chipped away at and transformed. But in the midst of that process, it's very confusing. And of course, differences then are slowly becoming fixed divisions. We know that every people that we've known of on the planet, every every tribal group, in any culture at any time has a distinction between us and them. We are the people and they are them. That's built into us in part as a survival mechanism, but it's also the case that people equate us with the good guys and they are evil. And this is Manichaeism. Manichaeism was deemed by the early Christian church to be a heresy, that it's one thing to make distinctions among groups, it's another thing to think of ourselves as good and them as evil in a way that we can punish them. But if you're paying any attention, not just to politics in the United States, but sadly to politics in this country, Manichaeism is creeping into our language and our culture. And it's the case that Albertans are hurting, that they've been hurting since 2014. And this is a graph done by Bob Aska, a colleague. And what I want you to look at is that little yellow bit on the right-hand side, the bit that's highlighted in yellow, because that was the fall of the price of oil in 2014. Now, the rest of Canada at this time did not experience a major recession, but Alberta has been in difficult times for 6 years. Now, I acknowledge that when Alberta's flying high and the rest of the country's in a recession, Albertans basically don't care a lot about what's happening in New Brunswick. But we are, after all, human, and Albertans are pretty angry that we've been in trouble for 6 years and the rest of Canada doesn't seem to care. And it's also the case that it was about 2014-15 that the literature and leaders in the environmental movement, in the Indigenous First Nations, and interestingly enough in the Bank of England, began to say things that were much more strident. It began to sink into us over this same period of time that the long-term future of oil and gas isn't what we thought it was. So here's Mark Carney, in effect saying what he got when he was governor of the Bank of England, what he got the pension fund to do. I mean, he talks here as if it's their study. He actually talked them in, badgered them into it. Because he said, what I want to know is what amount of global warming is already built into the amount of financing that's already been committed to in the oil and gas industry worldwide. This is not new commitments, things you might think about. These are deals that have already been signed. And what they discovered is that we're already committed. If all of that stuff is done, we're committed to 3.7 to 3.8 degrees of warming. And that's why Mark Carney has been a leading figure. But Albertans have heard him as attacking Alberta. Albertans have seen people taking their money out of Alberta, the large oil companies, whether Total or the Norwegian oil companies or others. They have abandoned Alberta in this period of time. And Albertans have become somewhat paranoid about it, thinking that somehow there's a game to destroy the oil industry in Alberta and leave everything else alone. Because, of course, what we look out to is American, and during the same time, fracking in the US has just gone nuts. Now, you probably know that fracking has been basically a bankrupt industry from the get-go. It's been a Ponzi scheme, no more than that. And the banks have finally figured that out, but it took them 6 years to figure it out. Here's another of Bob's things, his diagrams that show the percentage of total provincial government revenue in Alberta that came from oil and gas. Goes back to about 10 years into the Lougheed time, so that in 1981-82, almost 50% of the income of the government of Alberta was from oil and gas. I mean, that's extraordinary. If you look even at the down times, it means that for most of the last, 40 years, at least 20%, somewhere between 20 and 45% of the income of the government of Alberta has reliably come from oil and gas. And then it falls off the cliff in 2014 to go lower than it has in recent history. And then COVID hit. And that's why people out here genuinely are suffering, and they're also upset. That's why it's easy to feed paranoia. It's easy to feed a Manichaean sense that somehow we are hard done by them, whoever your favorite them is. And so the Alberta government has established a multi-million-dollar, now multi-year, one-person commission to inquire into anti-Alberta energy campaigns, convinced that there have been anti-Alberta energy campaigns in both Canada and the United States, and for God knows, maybe elsewhere in the world. That's what these folks are supposed to figure out. It'll be interesting to see what they report, because most of us look at it and say, no, I'm sorry, that's not what has been going on. We've been learning. And yes, that learning has led us to draw money out of Alberta, but we've done it a lot of other places as well. So here are Albertans who share these things getting together almost a year ago in a conference in Calgary, 600 people. I was there, 600 people on the value of Alberta. And they were going to talk about the value of Alberta under a number of different headings. But look at the premise that we have a government in Ottawa imposing a blockade on Alberta. We're causing a national emergency in Canada. Well, that's not true. There's nobody else thinks there's a national emergency in Canada because Alberta's upset other than Albertans. Now, Albertans will do their very best to make that a national emergency. And if we let them get away with it, they will. And they're saying to themselves, there's an urgent need for a new deal. And so these people came together supposedly to explore this as a proposition. And they had, remarkable academics, mostly people from the Calgary School, as well as others. But what I heard is that with the exception of the two Indigenous leaders, every last one of them was committed to the view that Alberta's hard done by and must, quote, fight back. The two Indigenous people said when it came to separation, if you separate, you will have the most splotchy province in Canada, because all those splotches are our reserves and our relationship is with the Crown, not you guys. And therefore, that that land stays as federal land because we keep that relationship to the Crown. And if you don't like it, tough. That's what the Constitution says and what the treaties say. It shocked the people in the room. They had assumed that Indigenous people could be bought by an Alberta government as easily as a federal government. So Jason Kenney, in recent, I've just forgotten the date, but I'll find it. This is in the Globe. In the past year, he's saying, I've heard more expressions of support for Western or Alberta separatism than I've heard my whole life. It's a reflection of a deep frustration from people who think, well, what the hell? We've helped the Federation pay the bills. We've played by the rules. We haven't really complained about it. And yet we're getting royally screwed here. The hypocrisy of this country is driving a level of alienation I haven't seen in my whole life. People are angry and should be. And the important thing is there, and should be, that here's Jason Kenney, the Premier of Alberta, signaling to people that it's all right to be angry, to be fussed. And so here, cart on a cartoon, the first couple of days in office, Jason Kenney hit the ground running. And if you listen at all to his speeches now going forward, if you haven't been listening in the past, he is often quite psychologically violent when he talks of Ottawa and talks of the Prime Minister. Not merely dismissive. In other words, it's well beyond the normal kinds of ways that provinces have picked on Ottawa as the source of their trouble. So Jason Kenney uses the language of fight back, that in my view, I experience him as a male who got stuck emotionally at about 22. And if you remember, I remember the time, I remember when I was like this, that I was pretty smart, but when people challenged me, I didn't have the maturity to handle that well. And my initial stance was pugilistic. I would go back at them. I would fight. And my wife, God bless her, helped me train that out of me in a variety of ways. We won't go there. So here is a group called Alberta Fights Back. They picked up the Premier's language, and should Alberta ditch Canada? So the coming struggle is being brought to you by quite a wide range of people, including, you will see, the government of Alberta. The report to the government on the fair deal was a panel that Kenny set up to travel Alberta, asking the question, what do we have to do to get a fair deal for Alberta? And you'll note that the question presupposes we don't have a fair deal. In other words, in his mind, in the mind of these people, the question has never been asked as a genuinely open question. Are we being abused, and do we not have a fair deal? It's rather presumed that the data is read in a way that we don't have a fair deal, and therefore we have to fight back. Now, if you are even a fourth-year student in the humanities and social sciences, let alone a graduate student, you don't get to pass courses with that kind of thinking. You actually have to learn to treat those you contend with more integrity. But all of these people have got their dander up. The Wild Rose Party is the new name of the Independence Party, which will run in the next provincial election to try to elect people who want Alberta independence provincially. They'll come up. There's a new name for the federal Independence Party. So the elements of the drama are, in a sense, pretty straightforward. That Albertans and some Westerners are alienated. Now, I take that factually as true, but whether that's a self-induced alienation, in other words, whether they've talked themselves into it without justification or not, has never been asked. In my view, the justification for it is ever so much weaker than the kind of war drums that are now being beaten in Alberta. What they're saying is either change Canada to suit them, or they will at least leave psychologically and as much legally as the Constitution allows. In other words, they're absolutely taking their play from the Quebec playbook. And as we know that as governments, this is, interestingly, it's not true broadly of the people in Quebec. The people in Quebec are more attached to Canada than the role their governments, even the last Liberal government, play the card, the separatist card of threatening Quebec separation or alienation so they can squeeze more stuff out of Canada. And by and large, Canadians have played along with it because we realize we're dealing with a significantly different culture than in the rest of the country. Not true of Alberta. And of course, the last chance then, if you don't do that, we'll just separate. Here you can see with the Wild Rose Independence Party, their third point, Albertans find themselves daily confronted by a federal government far removed with destructive predatory policies designed to exploit and obstruct for its own ends at our expense. This is pretty hyped up stuff. Here's the Buffalo Declaration, written by 4 conservative members of Parliament. Remember, these are people, in order to be members of Parliament, have had to swear allegiance to the Queen of Canada and to care for Canada. And they are now saying these things, that Alberta is not and never has been an equal participant in Confederation. It's a culturally distinct region that has not been recognized, which in my view is playing horse feathers. There's no sociologist of any repute would agree with that. If you're actually, unless you're saying in the smallest kind of way, they're culturally distinct, in which case, so is PEI, so is Prince Edward County in Ontario. If you're talking at that level, of course it is, but then it's a vacuous statement. Alberta is physically and structurally isolated from economic and political power. It's as if somehow Alberta used to be located just north of Toronto in Muskoka, and we weren't physically located from, Zachary, if you could turn off your camera, thank you. That somehow folks in Ottawa are responsible that Alberta has been pushed way out west up against the Rocky Mountains. Eastern Canada functionally treats Alberta as a colony rather than an equal partner. And they talk of Eastern Canada as the Laurentian elites, and some of you may not have heard that language before. It began to emerge about a dozen years ago John Ibbotson in the Globe and Mail is one of those who's been peddling it, trying again to draw these lines, to say us and them, and to heighten. I mean, John always supports Western alienation in his columns. The Maverick Party is the new name of the Wexit Party for Canada. This party will run in the next federal election. And what they want to do is either constitutional change or create an independent nation, namely in Alberta or Western Canada, whoever will come along and play. And they make such statements as the bottom one, from 2007 to 18, the West made 75% of all the money in Canada, and the East spent 87% of all the money in Canada. And the last 4 years, they have been crippling our energy sector, the financial engine of Canada. So this is the way these people have come to see Alberta, that Alberta is the guts of the economy of Canada. Canada isn't bright enough to know this, and if we were bright enough to know it, we would suck up to them. Now notice that these people are entirely with a business ethic. In other words, the highest business ethic is quid pro quo. You do something for me, I do something for you. It's, quote, a fair relationship. There's nothing in a business ethic that is about self-sacrifice. There's nothing in a business ethic that is about love, that you might give more to your marriage or a relationship than you get back for a while. These are straight transactional relationships counted by cash. And at this point, you should be hearing the voice of that marvelous young woman from Sweden telling, when she spoke at the UN, when she said, in effect, for God's sake, you're only in it for the money while you kill the planet. And so here are three of Canada's supposed, all tenured professors at the University of Calgary have written this book that peddles this line. They've talked a couple of other people into sharing that line to say, well, you see, it's all of us. In most of it is the old Calgary School, and it's a line the Calgary School has been peddling for 30 years. So now they've got some traction with it. This is Jack Mintz in his slides at the conference. Political strategies of my generation, the West wants in, that's Preston Manning and the Reform Party, would be a disservice. They didn't work. Would be a disservice to the next generation to say otherwise. Today, we're more vulnerable to the Liberals' tried and true strategy of pillaging Alberta economy to buy votes in Ontario and Quebec. It's time for Plan B. So if you don't think this isn't seeding psychological violence and even hatred, you're not paying attention. And we try to gussy it up. The Alberta government created a new center called the Canadian Energy Centre, which sounds like a nice, innocent name. It's actually funded by the Alberta government as a propaganda arm. It's the first time in the history of any Canadian government that they have funded a separate body to be a propaganda arm in their country with public money. And the job is to tell Canadians who are not bright enough to understand that Albertans are paying the bills and therefore we should be beholden to Alberta. And so when we work, Canada works. Here are all the employees of the energy sector scattered around Canada. Absolutely misleading, because 75% of those people are actually in Alberta. If this sign was honest, it would have a little shape of Alberta and 75% of those people would be in it. They'd be standing on each other's heads. And there'd be a few more in Saskatchewan and BC and a smattering in Newfoundland and hardly anybody else in the country. And we don't get it of how offensive this is understood outside Canada, outside Alberta. That when we work, that's we in Alberta, Canada works. It reminds me of the slogans that Bill Davis put up in Ontario. Ontario in the 80s, being the manufacturing hub of Canada, the sign said, "Buy Canadian, keep Ontario working." And he didn't understand how offended the rest of us would be. Please, he got the message and within 2 weeks took them down. We can ask how long it will take Alberta to learn. I say that as an Albertan, it breaks my heart. This again is Jack Mintz. The $611 billion since 1961 has become a mythical figure. It is quoted all over the place. It's quoted in a whole variety of ways. What Jack figured out is that over those years, that's a long period of time, it's almost 60 years, Alberta sent more money to Ottawa in taxation and the kinds of ways we send money to Ottawa than Ottawa spent back in Alberta. And somehow during that same time, Ottawa sent $476 billion to Quebec, which makes it look as if Alberta just wrote a check for Quebec. And that's the story out here, that equalization has just meant those two numbers at top, and we got to stop this because Quebec, for God's sake, won't even allow an energy pipeline across its territory, and nobody will challenge that. And so Energy East got squelched, and we can't even sell our oil. And so these are the stories, when of course equalization doesn't work that way. Anybody who knows anything about equalization, I mean, this is fake news of the highest level. This is a fully tenured professor sharing fake news, and he's bright enough to know that he is, but he has a cause, and the cause is worth it. And so here is a different way. This was part of Ted Morton's presentation. Fairness Alberta has an Alberta transfer meter just to remind Albertans how much money is transferring to Ottawa. Remember, it's all about the money. And the top number is the total since the year 2000. The bottom number is from January 1, 2007 to December 31, 19, which creates the impression that every family in Alberta would be richer by 61,000 if somehow the unfairness of Canada was dealt with. This is just a map of the net contributions, and it's true that for the last several years, BC, Alberta, and Ontario were the only provinces with strong enough economies to contribute to Canada. But rather than taking a sense of people who actually understand what they mean when they sing the Canadian national anthem, of standing on guard for Canada, rather than taking pride in saying, we're helping to build a better country, it gets framed at, you bastards are taking advantage of us. And so here, again, from Ted Morton's presentation, an absolutely false image, as if Justin Trudeau said, screw the West, we'll take the rest. It's a 1980 election campaign in the midst of an election. And one of Trudeau's top advisors did say that on an open mic. But in an election campaign, lots of things get said that wouldn't be said in normal times. But as in Quebec, with its license plate that says never forget, this is encouraging a culture and a psychology of resentment. Remember all the ways you've been put down. And we've never been able to talk Quebec out of it. But any psychologist knows that a psychology of resentment is unhealthy. You don't want it in yourself, your children, your family, or your country. This was in a display put in many of the airports in Canada in 2019, paid for by the Alberta government, to remind Canadians of how much the cost was that the Trans Mountain Pipeline was being delayed by Indigenous and other complaints. And the complaint was that, by God, if we had a real government in Ottawa, they'd just run over those bloody Indigenous people and get it built. And it's costing us now by $10 billion. And you'll see the numbers on the right-hand side are changing. They used to be 857, and now they're 867, and now they're going to 969. And of course, there's talk about guns and the Senate and bilingualism and new rules of environmental assessment and the tanker ban off the Northwest BC coast and the UN Declaration of Indigenous rights. So here are the kinds of things that they want done. This turns out to be from Project Confederation, but this list is a pretty decent list if you talk to all the other groups. Not everybody has every item. But it's there in the mix. You're going to hold a referendum to abolish equalization. Well, that's not going to happen. It's in the Constitution. To start with, we have one of the most difficult constitutions in the world to change. And if we open it, even for this, everybody else and their dog will want pieces in. And nobody else in Canada, including actually the majority of Albertans, as the polls in Alberta now show, the majority of Albertans are in favor of equalization. So that referendum may fail. And you can go through the list, but what I'm worried about is the psychology that basically says, do not trust Ottawa, do not trust the federal government, do not trust the Laurentian elites, do not trust them. They are out to get us. Does that remind you of anybody who was just defeated south of the border? I mean, this is a psychology that Newt Gingrich brought. Before Newt Gingrich, politics was pretty normal, and deals across the aisle in the United States were pretty normal. But from 1993 on, the sickness of creating enemies across the aisle has gotten to the point now where Americans are more upset if their children marry outside their political views rather than outside their religion or their economic status. That's just nuts. And we in Canada are headed the same way, because there will be a municipal election in Alberta in October, and the Premier is going to make sure that all this stuff gets mixed up with that election. We're not only electing municipal councillors and school board members, we're having 3 referendums. One will be an Alberta referendum to remove equalization from the Constitution, which is about as effective as Canada having a referendum on whether Alberta should have a different speed limit. In other words, it is constitutionally, it's irrelevant. It's ultra vires. It has nothing to do. And the Premier knows that, and all these people know that. This is entirely fake news to get people on the warpath. And let's have an Alberta police force rather than the Mounties, because the Mounties are given directions if push comes to shove by people in Ottawa, and we can't have that. And let's have an Alberta pension plan, because Alberta, if short run, it may be to Alberta's advantage to do that. We have a younger population, and therefore more people are paying into pensions than are taking out, and so it might give us some more money to work with. But let me tell you, my wife, who's a nurse and has pensions both from Ontario and Alberta, doesn't want Jason Kenney's grimy fingers anywhere near her pension plan. And the Premier has changed the law. The law used to be that any money that was devoted to provincial elections was both limited and had to be public. And he has changed the law now so that endless dark money can be given both to candidates and to political action committees. In other words, he's hoping that the center right and the far right in Alberta will put up more money than the center left and the far left. And if history is any indication, they will. It's true in the US. It's also true here in spades. Alberta may turn out in that sense that even its towns and villages have elected people who are in the back pockets of the UCP. And what I fear, as you can tell from my tone of voice, is that psychological violence is now legitimate in Alberta. That we've gotten to the point that when something is said in a way that causes damage, we're so used, it's normalized, as it is in the United States. It's been normalized in the US for some very long time. And it is now normalized in Alberta, as I will demonstrate to you. When he, that is the Premier, was asked whether he should accept any personal responsibility for the approach to the pandemic that arguably had cost hundreds of people their lives, Kenney took great umbrage with the reporter's proposition. You have just joined the folks who are doing drive-by smears on Alberta, the Premier huffed. Back to the 22-year-old pugilist. He has identified himself with Alberta, and if you attack him, you attack Alberta. Moi, I am Alberta. And therefore, he's weaponizing Alberta citizenship, that if you're a real Albertan, you will fight back against these evil people, and you will protect me, and I am blameless. Does that remind you of any other politician around now? Hungary comes to mind. The next day, during a radio interview, Gary Mason observes it was put to the premier that when it came to handling the second wave of the virus, his government's record was among the worst, if not the worst, in the country. Kenny again called the notion downright unpatriotic. I don't accept the Alberta bashing going on around here. I could take hours with these kind of examples. This is now normal in Alberta. People at street corners honk if you agree with the proposition, honk if you hate Trudeau. If this sign said honk if you hate Jews, think of what the fuss would be. Think it would be if you put honk if you hate Islam. Honk if you want Nenshi gone. Nenshi is the mayor of Calgary. Many towns and municipalities in Alberta are more progressive than the provincial government and long have been. And the provincial government takes this pugilistic stance to fight with them. So it's become part of the same deal now, that if you want the firearms, if you're against the federal government's view on firearms and on oil, then let's get rid of these, municipalities as well. They're just difficult. There sadly are thousands of pickup trucks in Alberta who have these signs on them. I love Canada's energy, fuck Trudeau. Ironically, this was parked on the main street in Canmore, right in front of the front door of the Little United Church, to which I belong. Grotto Mountain is in the distance. I first thought it's offensive to park it in front of the church, and then I thought, well, the church is supposed to be about understanding, grace, and forgiveness, so maybe they picked the right place. And I want to suggest, without sounding too partisan, that this man in particular is the go-to pit bull for the Conservative Party nationally. And he's not only into psychological violence and has been for a long time, he's now into various conspiracy theories. This is just the latest. It maps on to the same space. And this was Monday in the Globe and Mail, that a company in Ottawa that had a contract with the federal government to find employees to build a new unit within the federal government, which would handle the process of buying back rifles because of the federal government's new gun legislation, was itself threatened by the gun lobby to the point where the people said, we can't put our own staff at risk. We don't know if any of these things will come true, but we're not going to risk it. And they gave up the contract. And when you think how women cabinet ministers in the Trudeau cabinet, that their physical offices have been attacked, and they, of course, have been attacked with psychological violence. So it's become normalized in Canada, and to date, we don't have any politicians who will address it, including, sadly, the Prime Minister. So what's the best case that could happen? Well, the referendums are defeated. That may well be the case. The polling data at the moment is that they're all would be supported by 35% of the population, but that's a clear defeat if that doesn't change. That he would then put some water in his policy wine and back off being so aggressive, and he might at best be defeated in 2023. And a lot of this then would just go away, because if my hypothesis is right, this is a made-up act that Albertans are, who in a sense don't pay enough attention to politics to know that they've been just made peons in Jason Kenney's army. But the worst case is really quite terrifying. Yes, the referendums are defeated, but then people would say they were defeated because somehow, as Donald Trump says, it wasn't legitimate and they did it to us. And so we'll double down on the twin agendas that Jason Kenney clearly has. The first, which is what he ran on, is making Alberta one of the last places in the world that is safe for red state free market capitalism. The red state then in quotes is clearly a reference to the US, but he wants a fire-breathing Republican version of free market capitalism. He is now giving permission to Australian companies for a 1% royalty to destroy the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains, to take the tops off the mountains to get coal to ship to China in a time where we're just beginning to understand climate change and its threat to us. And what's more, he's putting himself in the position to be able to do whatever he wants to be, so that there's no effective opposition to him. That is quite alarming. I won't take the time now. If it interests you, we can raise it in a question time. My commitment is picked up here in the words of the Rainbow Report, which was the Premier's Commission on the Future of Healthcare for Albertans, the final report in December '89. I was their resident futurist. And it's through the process, it became clear to the Commission that Albertans were telling us that it is no longer good enough to merely to learn to do better what Albertans already do well. We were being told it would be remiss to recommend extending the course on which healthcare had been developing. And it goes on to say we have to learn to think futures and not just improve what we've got, but transcend them by thinking about and redesigning for a fundamentally different future. Our real task as Albertans is to do what's necessary to nurture and sustain healthy Albertans, supported by an increasingly responsive healthcare system in increasingly healthy Alberta, an increasingly healthy world. And in the place of healthcare systems, I put there all systems: education, healthcare, highways, electronics, you name it. We know in KCOR that it all needs to be reimagined for the 21st century. That has been and is my commitment, whether living in Alberta or now. But this is the piece that has me joining Heather in resisting the Premier. Nice people made the best Nazis. My mom grew up next to them. They got along, refused to make waves, looked the other way when things got ugly, and focused on happier things than politics. They were lovely people who turned their heads when their neighbors were dragged away. You know who weren't nice people? Resistors. So I have joined the resistance in Alberta. Let me finish with John McMurray, who in his Dunning Trust lectures, The Conditions of Freedom, in 1949 said at my university, Queen's, to be rid of illusions, if it does not break our courage, is a liberating experience. And I am now engaged in the struggle in Alberta to help liberate us in Alberta from the illusions that are being spread about the way we have been abused and what we need to do about it. Thank you.
Wow, that's amazing, Ruben. As the person sort of running the question and answer period, I was thinking I was going to run up a few questions, but boy, you've given a lot of food for thought there. As I said in my introduction, I am a native Albertan. I grew up in Calgary, and in fact, I'm what I refer to as an oil patch brat. My father worked in the oil industry his whole career. And what I saw in Calgary and in Alberta as I was growing up is a completely different community than what I see when I go back to Alberta. And it's very disturbing. And I don't know what to say about it. When I speak to my friends and colleagues in Calgary, when I go back, my family, none of them really agree with Jason Kenney, but they don't know what to do about it.
Yes.
So you said you've joined the resistance. What can be done about it?
Well, one thing that can be done is the people on the right in Canada have several institutions to support their work and ideology. I think of the Manning Institute, which holds an annual conference for right-minded people. I think of C.D. Howe now. They're not quite as far right, but they're well over on that spectrum. I think of the Calgary School of Public Policy, which ironically was funded by Jim Palmer, who was capital L liberal and a small L liberal all his life. I think of the Fraser Institute. there's almost nothing in Alberta that is credible. In fact, there is nothing in Alberta that is credible, that would be credible to a broad section of Albertans whose job is to create a Rolodex of the people like your friends and colleagues who are somewhat upset but don't know what to do about it.
Mhm.
So there's not even a Rolodex of them. My Rolodex may be as good as any, because we ran an organization that at one point had 5,000 people. It wasn't in any sense partisan. It was talking about almost like K-Core-ish kinds of things.
Mhm.
So one of the things I will do is test the capacity of people on the center and center left in Alberta to see if they're willing to see this danger enough to actually begin to put up some serious money, because we need to hire some unemployed university students to do some community development and have others running the software of collecting the names and building the websites and using the kinds of platforms that I don't use, but that if you're under 30 are your normal ways of functioning.
Mhm. Thank you. Gord, you have some questions and comments.
Yeah. How I have been a Green Party candidate against Pierre Poilievre, who you mentioned, and yeah, everything you said about him is true. So I want to ask, what do you think you could do about Pierre, given this insight that I have, and I've met him many times, and I've had meetings with him. He does what he does because it works. He doesn't have any, like, he's like this straw man, in my opinion. And everything you say is true, but he does it because it works with the people.
Yep.
He doesn't have any conviction or brains or opinions himself, actually, but it's working. So therefore he does it. So the issue that I see is the population. This kind of approach is working with people. So how do you respond to it when you can't just point at Pierre and so on, which are instruments and visible, but they're like a result. They're not a cause. So
I agree. I absolutely agree with your analysis, and therefore I'm not. I won't do anything about Pierre, but I'll tell you what. One of the things that would be different. Let's assume that we can find some money in Alberta, and we begin to put together more of an organized resistance. One of the things we will say to ourselves and therefore to each other as Albertans is that this is deeply ethical work. In other words, we will move away from the First Enlightenment's absolute separation of value from the objective world. The First Enlightenment told us a story that we were subjective people who valued things, valued verb, and therefore created value, but we lived in a dead, cold, and valueless world unless we valued it. And so part of what's happening is simply, you see it in Donald Trump, you see it in Pierre, you see it in so much stuff. The logic of the First Enlightenment is now actually coming to eat its own children. And it's doing it more so. The US is a demonstration project that Canadians need to learn from. So that we need to say quite openly to people that the resistance is going to model the highest ethical standards that we in Alberta aspire to holding ourselves to. And let me tell you, that then deals with, it begins to say that, of course, we won't open up the eastern slopes of the Rockies just to sell coal at a 1% royalty to China. And so that it becomes a conversation that is not just intellectual and economic, transactional. It becomes a conversation of passion and of love and of caring and of putting yourself on the line. So it's including spirit, mind, body, heart. And my sense is that those kind of campaigns historically, not in all cases, but historically tend in the long run to win over campaigns that are merely functional.
So we have to change the conversation in effect.
It's changing the nature of the conversation and the relationship. That we're changing we're inviting people into a different relationship, and therefore it's a different conversation. But the relationship is primary. Our Indigenous cousins would tell us that start with relationships.
Thank you. Anyway, great job, Ruben. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Gord. The next person who has some comments and questions is John Mayer.
Okay. There we go. Okay. I just wonder if this, what you're talking about, Ruben, the Alberta First Movement is in effect a proxy for the oil industry. When I look at the transfers that you put up, the transfer amounts, I mean, those are eye-opening.
Yes, they are.
They were done in an era. There are three aspects of the fossil fuel industry aside from coal in Alberta: conventional oil, natural gas, and the oil sands. Conventional oil and natural gas have probably always been profitable. The oil sands, once you include their legacy costs, which are immense, I don't think are profitable. I don't think they'll ever be profitable. So that going forward, conventional oil is running out. It's becoming increasingly less of a contributor. And Alberta is developing, their growth is based on the oil sands. And I don't think these are profitable, but they're still turning huge dollars. If you multiplied the barrels in the ground of oil sands times, say, $50, that's the value is about $8.5 trillion divided by 100 years. That's $85 billion of revenue a year. Who's, hard to resist, except that you're losing money, and no business is big enough to fail. And I just wonder if this is the oil industry covering itself, as it does so well, with other issues, so that it can continue to make money while it puts the costs of cleanup and everything else onto the taxpayer at a much later date. So
I agree with all the data that you've set out. I interpret the situation more broadly, because if I am to speak with any integrity about not agreeing with Manichae and Manichaeism, then I can't just look at the oil industry, as some people do, as if we just get rid of that, then we're free to go. It's like a lot of people think we just get rid of climate change, then the rest of our modern world works. Well, I'm sorry, folks, it doesn't. We're in way deeper trouble than that. And so that we have conspired together in Alberta. We have allowed ourselves to be talked into. I say this as an Albertan. We as citizens have not been paying the freight for all the services of our governments since at least 1980, which is when Peter Lougheed decided to stop to start using money from royalties as earned income. And that's now become the norm. So Albertans over the last 40 years have gotten used to receiving somewhere between 20 and 50% more services from government than what they actually pay for. And we see ourselves then being virtuous that we don't have a sales tax, because we can say, look how fiscally conservative we are. That's part of our story. And in fact, it's not a barefaced lie, because you only are lying if you actually understand that what you're saying is false. But we haven't had the quality of leaders to explain to us. And the interesting thing is, it's not just business leaders who haven't explained to us. It's university leaders who haven't explained to us. There's never been a university president in Canada, in Alberta, who's taken on the well-being of Alberta as the central passion of that university. So no university president has ever accepted that part of their job of being president of U of A or U of C, or there's several of them now, that in fact the well-being of Alberta is part of their remit. They've all done what has happened in most institutions over the last 40 years, and it's become shareholder business as opposed to stakeholder business. So presidents of universities look after universities, businesses look after businesses, governments look after governments, and if what Per Poilievre does works, it gets them elected. And nobody actually cares about the whole system. And certainly nobody cares about the integrity and ethics of the whole system.
Mhm.
And if you want to see where that logic takes you, just I say, watch south of the border. They've been at it longer than we have. But to think we're not headed in the same direction, I think is a fool's game.
Yeah. Okay, I agree. I'd like to put a couple of more stats, and that is in 2000, Alberta, since 2000, the Alberta Heritage Fund has essentially remained flat. So over the
Yes,
last few years,
absolutely.
the oil sands, it's remained flat, hasn't been built up, and the provincial debt has gone to $50 billion. You put up a stat of the contributions by Albertans to Canada. If you look at the per capita Albertan cost of remediating the oil sands, that comes in at about $50,000 per Albertan.
Yes, absolutely.
To me, the fundamental, the core issue is, does the oil sands, when you sort it all out, does the oil sands make money? I'm saying it doesn't for Albertans or anybody else. And I just try and make that message. Anyway.
And I agree with you in terms of the finances. I mean, in terms of if you include all costs in the oil sands are like fracking. The fracking business is a Ponzi scheme. That's clear now. Even the banks know that, and it's dying. But we don't know that yet about the oil sands. My point is, rather than joining those who want to talk about oil companies as if that's our problem, I want to talk to Albertans about us being the problem. The old saying used to be, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. My saying is, if you don't see yourself as part of the problem, you can't be part of the solution. Because we have to learn to take responsibility for the fact that we as Albertans have let oil companies build up these extraordinary assets off everybody's books. And in the last analysis, they're on the public book. But that's up to us. That's on us, not just on them. If we have gone along with it, at some point we have to. This goes back to Rosie Parks in 1954 in Montgomery, Alabama, when she refused to move to the back of the bus. And her statement was, I can no longer connive with you, that what you're doing is right and just. And in order for you to get away with it, I have to go along with it. And I've now figured that out as a Black person. So up yours, Charlie. But we need citizens who know that we have connived with the oil company. We've been in bed together. Don't now claim that you're innocent. They're not innocent either. But if we make enemies of each other in this, we will tear Alberta apart. And in the process, who knows how that might wash out into Canada.
Wow, thank you. Joseph Ingram, you're up.
Okay, hang on now. Where do I? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay. Ruben, this was a wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it and learned a lot. And John, I very much appreciated your comments just now. I want to go a little more deeply into what you said. I should add that I recently had a paper published by the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. Ted Manning may have sent it to some of you. They commissioned me to write the paper, and it was titled Canadian Energy Security in an Age of Existential Threat. And it was peer reviewed. It was not an op-ed, it was more an academic paper by blind peer review by two professors, I think at the University of Calgary. Okay. But surprisingly, they liked it, and they gave me some very good comments, and they definitely improved the paper, and they shared the conclusions, which was interesting. Now, I'm not from Alberta, but my sister has been an emeritus professor at the University of Alberta for the last 45 years. And so we spent a lot of time when we're in Canada in Alberta. And needless to say, she and people around her in the academic community and in their community in Edmonton have no love for Jason Kenney and for the current government. But I think it's interesting, Ruben, in terms of what you said. I'm not sure that I'm not quite as pessimistic as you might be. When you consider that Nemshi, who was gay Muslim, was elected as mayor of Calgary, the most conservative city arguably in Canada, that says something about the constituents in Calgary. Now, secondly, when you consider that Alberta also elected an NDP government at one point prior to Jason Kenney, that also says something about the broader constituency. I don't think they're all ranchers and people with sympathies to and like-minded to Texans, as you're suggesting. There may be grounds for hope given the way they've behaved electorally in the past. And as you say, with people and institutions mobilizing that kind of support and making people aware of what's at stake, there may be some hope there. Now, to come back to John's point, it's important, and I put this in the paper that I wrote, in Canada, and this came from a government report. In Canada, only 42% of reserves can be produced with Brent crude priced at $60 a barrel. Okay, that share falls to 16% of Brent crude or of reserves at $40 a barrel. Okay. And the energy needed to extract and refine Canada's bitumen from the oil sands makes them even less appealing and less profitable. So John is absolutely correct. And as you know, Brent crude it hasn't moved much. It's come up a little. It's gone up and down, but it's at a price now where and it's going to become even less positive. The economists recently talked about the failure or the dying of the petrostates, and this is an inevitable trend that will continue. And basically, Alberta is going to find itself, and I think voters in Alberta will recognize this at some point, that relying, as you rightfully put, so heavily on oil and gas is a losing proposition, and it's just not viable, and that there needs to be diversification. Now, having said that, the Canadian government, the federal government, has also been complicit in this. The federal government in Canada, as you know, has been amongst the highest subsidizers of the oil and gas industry of any country on the planet. In per capita terms, I think it's only Saudi Arabia and Australia who provide a larger level of subsidies. And that's coming from Ottawa, from Liberal governments, as well as from the Harper government. So there's been complicity in this. And for years, and when I was president of the North-South Institute, I attended several conferences where John Baird was then the foreign minister, where we talked about, and John Manley, we talked about the critical need for the federal government to start helping the provinces through subsidies diversify the economy. And of course, the other aspect is that they rely so heavily on exports of oil and gas to the United States. And at least under Trump, we know what that resulted in, with prospects not being very good, and the U.S. applying tariffs on Canadian exports of aluminum and steel for quote unquote security reasons. So I think people will begin to see the writing on the wall, but Ottawa has to move on this as well. And clearly, in diversifying, Ottawa needs to start redirecting some of those subsidies into renewable energy, research and development in renewable energy, and a lot of that could be directed to the province of Alberta. And retraining people, so that Alberta benefits as much from this transition, if not more so, than any other province in Canada. Now, the other thing, I made the comment about Kenny and some of these people moving to Texas. I was struck by your list. You didn't mention it separately, but amongst those 9 points was that Alberta would take responsibility for controlling immigration into the province. I thought that was a very interesting, and it reflects something more than just the reliance on oil and gas. It reflects the same kind of reaction that you're getting in the United States, and amongst Republicans especially, and those who see them as a threat, and them as changing the culture and changing the comfort levels which people in Alberta, and arguably in the rest of Canada, it's not just in Alberta where people think that way. And that was a rather striking thing, though, in that it was specifically identified amongst those 9 points that you listed. So anyway, congratulations. I thought it was a great presentation.
If I may, 2 quick comments. One is, make sure Art puts your paper up on the KCOR website, so it's available to all of us. We can download it.
All right, I will do that.
Okay. Secondly,
Say
I
it
don't.
is up.
It is there.
now.
Oh, it's
It is up
there
now.
now. Fine. That's all we need to know then.
Yeah.
Secondly, I don't want in any way to be heard as bad-mouthing Albertans. The Albertans are perfectly normal human beings, fairly decent, remarkably decent people in small groups, in their own communities, in their own families and homes, and remarkably blind to the systems that support them and that they participate in. And so far, there's nobody who has got into the public leadership business who's been, at least in most people in the public leadership business, the vast majority are not the least bit interested in the systems. They're interested, as Pierre Poilievre is, in getting immediate responses. And so I quite agree with you. There is all kinds of hope, but that hope also has a price. And that is that we actually have to grow up, that this business of facing up to what we're in is in part seen as growing out of. Our modern techno-industrial world needs adults who are essentially late adolescents. The male modern model is simply late adolescence. We want people who are competent, who are independent enough, but when push comes to shove, are beholden to authority of somebody else to say, you bloody well do it, I'm your boss. And that's an adolescent stage of life. We want our women to be even younger so they could be obedient to the men. And the irony is that in the modern world, women are outgrowing the men, and the men don't like it. That's also true in Japan. Different country, different culture, I'll leave it there. But what we need to do is, rather than have the men, and again, the oil business, and I mean, Alberta is a more male-dominated culture than probably any other part of Canada. And it shows this way. It shows that we're not learners. And so let's rather than demonizing the guys who, in a sense, have done the things they were told they had to do, support their families, get a job, make some money, and nobody ever asked them to do anything else. And rather than demonizing them, let's join hands with those who are willing and say, look, we're creating a context here that will help you not only contribute to Alberta, but will be a space that will nurture your own growth as a person. Mm-hmm. So that we get into the business of nurturing not just the growth of economies, but the growth of persons at every scale we exist as persons, from unique individuals to whole jurisdictions.
Can I just add, Gene?
No, you can't. Sorry, but other people.
I agree with you, Ruben. My wife and I were just. Sorry.
we got other people. If when we're done, there's still anybody on the line, I'm happy to deal with it, but other people are
We do
lined.
have others lined up, so if I
All
could
right, I'll
interject at
stop
this
there.
point, yeah. Susha, man, you're
Okay,
up.
thank you. Thank you, Ruben. Excellent. I agree with Joseph and yourself that we need to re-emphasize that this is not Alberta's problem alone. It is a Canadian problem. The electric vehicle is going to be costing same as the ICE or gas car in 3 years' time. And that's a major upheaval. And we also need to bring back some manufacturing in Canada. And in terms of focusing, some of the focus will be diverted rather than against the rest of Eastern Canada towards Biden, because he's the one who is going to be spearheading the fracking, oil sand, and piping. So I think that we have to be less concerned as how they are going to play by. Now, we have been protecting egg farmers, dairy farmers. We should be really protecting our indigenous community across Canada. We haven't really addressed that. Like, they should be really protected so they are employed in the good field. They can actually do manufacturing like winter shoes, winter jackets. We have to put hefty duties and also protect with tax system to our native people. And that will decrease the problem of unemployment and others. And if I may add another angle to it, there is a right-wing circle going on. It wasn't only Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump had some very good friends in Brazil, Brazil's president, India's prime minister. I just been there, and I see how India's prime minister and his private club, they have bought out all the television channels and newspaper, so to actually back them in kind of a right-wing kind of thing, how to separate people and focus on them. So Pierre Poulet is not the only one. There are a lot of people around the globe trying to mislead people. And but I think we need to really start thinking how to bring back some manufacturing. Just like cars, they have to be manufactured certain percentage from in North America. I was buying a lawnmower or a vacuum cleaner. There's nothing available from North America. So if we, come up with policies with our friends in Mexico and US, that we got to start bringing back manufacturing in North America. The content has to be some percentage manufactured in North America. We may get there. Otherwise, we are screwed. You go to any store, whether it's a Home Depot or Best Buy, there's hardly anything made in Canada. The only thing I could find made in Canada was a shovel. Thank you.
And do you have a question?
Well, I just want to re-emphasize what you've been saying. I think we have to actually associate with people in Alberta. That's not an Alberta problem. It's a problem for us all in Canada, and it has been as emphasized that the federal government has been part of the problem because they have not been focusing on manufacturing. They've been subsidizing our oil sand companies. Now people are walking away. Rest of the world is walking away from the oil sand. So it's not Canadians who are walking away, but the rest of the world is walking away, and our federal government did not focus in time on it.
Thank you, Sasha. Obviously, there's not a question, and we do have quite a few people lined up, so I'll interject at this point.
Thank you.
Sarah, you're up.
Hello. Speaking as a fellow Albertan, I don't really have a question, but I do have a few just thoughts that I wanted to share that were brought up by many things that Ruben was saying. I am an environmental consultant, and I do work in the oil fields at times. And going to rural Alberta, there are a lot of people who have expressed frustration to me over the years with our federal government, with all sorts of things. And they they feel comfortable talking to somebody like me because I'm face to face with them. And we talk about all sorts of things, and we're helping them clean up their sites because there's all sorts of things that have happened in the 50 years or more that some of these places have been in operation. And they've, you know, through the 50 years that they have been in operation, the regulations have changed drastically. And we talk about that, and we talk about how this is to help protect their health, and it's to help protect the health of their families and of their communities, and they really appreciate that. So I think one of the ways that we can at least start a conversation with people who are on the opposite sides of many of these divides that we have is to talk to them about something that matters to them, that actually is being protected for like more and more through more regulations, because a lot of these people view those regulations as a hindrance to their finances. They find that it's just a hindrance to doing business, where in fact what they're doing is trying to protect people's health, because 50 years ago those regulations weren't in place to protect their health. It's a really complicated conversation, but I think when you start to approach it from a more personal level, people do respond positively to those kinds of ideas. And the other thing that comes to mind is a lot of UCP voters are starting to communicate relative disappointment with how this current government has been managing, especially our health systems, but all sorts of other things as well. I think the pandemic has really brought forth how privatizing our healthcare system is a really bad idea. Most people here are against it. A lot of our rural doctors are starting to speak up a lot, and the people in rural areas who are predominantly UCP voters are starting to vocalize that they are discontented with the current situation. So, you know, our government is very publicly privatizing our healthcare system, but it's not a popular thing in Alberta. And I think that's another avenue where we might be able to do something like what Ruben's suggesting, which is to inform Albertans what the role of government has been and what it could be if we intervene and, you know, take some responsibility for our voting, take responsibility for engaging with the communities, and, you know, just because as he said, Albertans are generally very nice people. They're engaged citizens. They like having jobs. They like contributing, but I think they just are misdirecting their energies right now. And that's something that is something we can really work with if we try.
Thank you.
That's all I got.
Thank you, Sarah. Interesting observations. Ted, you're up.
Okay, I want to talk about cod. And the reason I'm raising that is that any industry that has essentially a half-life goes through various kinds of periods where it is no longer productive. In my family is essentially lives in Canada for several hundred years because their potatoes ran out. But what we have is we have a history already in certain parts of Canada for going into places where industries evolve from one to the next one. We've already spent a lot of money keeping cod fishers by and large in business in the Maritimes. We have a history of helping people move from one province to another to pursue the jobs they want. One of my daughters works in BC now because she's been thrown out of the oil patch and has a better job actually. But we're looking at a gradual evolution of work. I don't think we're ever going to be able to put the guys back underground digging coal. So we have to get people to realize that there is a time dimension to work, and therefore trying to convince people that over time they have to be flexible. And that is going to be a tough road. I mean, I think in Alberta, they've had a rougher time with this than many others do, or at least have had a much more visible lobbying capacity than most other places have. So The real question I guess I'm leading up to, is there any way that the Albertans who seem to be having such trouble right now with this will grasp the notion of having a changed future in which they have decent lifestyles and a decent environment without grabbing on so very strongly to what they had in the past?
I would hope that possibility exists now and will still exist. As I read the deep agenda of these folks, I'm really serious when I say they want Alberta as the future they're promising us is that Alberta can again be a place of extraordinary wealth based on high carbon energy.
Yeah.
And and based on what has come to be a fairly normal understanding of the market, but it's an understanding that increasingly the world is moving away from, realizing that neoliberal economics, in fact, has been extraordinarily destructive of both the planet and people. So the people who have at this point their hands on the levers of power are not interested in a serious alternative. They will talk of alternatives in terms of hydrogen and cheap energy, in other words, but serious thought about alternatives has never been a strong suit in Alberta. I have a file, not all that thick, but I have several letters of rejection over about 5 decades from the Alberta government saying we're really not interested in learning how to think long and hard and deeply about alternative futures.
Thank you.
Thanks. John Legge, you're up.
Thanks, Jean. Ruben, I echo all the other positive comments. And this is supposed to be a trap question. And that is, are there many Albertans who see the situation, that is the global situation, as one that is necessary, in which greenhouse gases are reduced? And if they do, which is the mainstream, if you wish, towards the future, how do Albertans go about dealing with this need? Since my understanding is trying to get oil out of the oil sands produces more greenhouse gases than any other activity. Or if not, if I've got that wrong, it's pretty high up. So how do Albertans see and understand the main current in the world? And if they do, what is their contribution to reducing greenhouse gases? Can you enlighten us on that?
Well, as in any province, you'll find different, not just groups, but you can kind of parse the population.
Right.
There are, I'm going to make a statement that seems to me to apply to our species generally. And that is, most people live in a culture they don't really understand. That is, they don't understand deeply. They've learned enough about the culture and some of its games, game in Wittgenstein's sense. What game are we playing? And they learn how to play the game and they do it well enough, but they don't really ask, is this a good game to play? They rather ask, can I get a good life for myself and my family and those I care for out of playing this game well? And in that sense, Albertans are no different. So there's no greater capacity in Alberta to ask those questions, but nor is there any less capacity. And if you look at the oil patch, it's split. It has always been split. That anybody who knows Alberta well and knows the oil patch knows that you can line the oil companies up on a spectrum. from those who would understand most of the conversations that go on in KCOR, and actually say, and we have to get at these things, and are willing to invest money and energy to begin to get at them. And that's true of some of the largest players here. One of the things they're annoyed about is that they don't get credit for the way in which new technologies over the last 30 years have dramatically had a smaller footprints on the planet. Not enough yet, but they don't even get credit for trying. It's people tend to just take the oil industry as they're all in this together. It's like Christians. If you're a Christian, then you're all in this mess together without any distinction. Whereas some are folks that I would happily deal with and work for, and others are people that I would not. I just would not. They have invested time and energy and money in protecting their egos and their jobs and their understanding of life. All of those things are normal for us as a human species. None of them, though, are very admirable. And so, anyway, that would be my take. Albertans are, broadly speaking, more progressive and more open to these things. Alberta typically gets among the highest ratings if you just ask citizens about their interests and commitments environmentally than almost any place. And if you know anything about the geography of Alberta, it makes sense. We have an extraordinary piece of this planet that we're responsible for. And therefore, there's a sense in which it's easy to become an environmentalist out here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. Bob Walker, you're up.
Can you hear me there? Can you see
Yes.
me?
And yes.
Okay. Ruben, that's a wonderful conversation here today. I suggest that your remarks have kind of stimulated discussion here in two broad perspectives. So one is Alberta and what's happening to its oil-based economy with the climate emergency, and it seems to be a dying industry and all that goes with that. And many of the comments have been, so how does Alberta deal with that? It seems to me you've also dove into this question of how society right now has polarized. You talk about kind of the reality of what's happened in the US, and maybe it's coming to Canada. We've seen our politics become hyper-partisanship, highly polarized. There was a time when politicians actually led policy conversations in Canada. I think that's been probably 20 years in the rearview mirror now. And so you've highlighted this need to have conversations again, conversations where we actually listen to one another, where we can get beyond our tribes, where we can actually think critically and accept somebody else's opinion and acknowledge that we may not agree, but we're trying to find a common ground. And it seems right now that we can't count on politics to lead that conversation. I am compelled by your remarks around we need conversations that are about the mind, the heart, and the spirit. And to me, that's what a wonderful platform, KCOR, to actually talk about how we do that. Because to me, that's the essence of it. And I've heard a number of threads of comments by people about when you actually talk to people personally about the issues at play, you can actually have a reasonable conversation and you can understand the pros and cons of various points of view. We need more of that. As one offer that I would put forward, and I was particularly taken by your remarks about universities, I think universities historically have been a platform where we've seen discussions occur around difficult issues. It seems that our universities aren't necessarily leading as perhaps they did maybe 20 years ago. And maybe that's the challenge, because it seems to me these conversations are conversations that have to start with our youth. They have to be at the people at the age of 20, 25 that are actually thinking about the world they're inheriting And if they come into their leadership place in society with critical thinking skills, willing to have respectful conversations, listening to different opinions, then perhaps we can begin to turn the ship around. I just wondered if you could say what you thought about that kind of comment, because it seems to me it is about the conversations, if I captured your key message correctly.
Well, that's certainly a big piece of it. I worry about a fractured and brittle culture, and we are more fractured and more brittle than we were. I mean, Bob, just looking at you, we're both of an age that we've had the advantage of living through kind of several mini incarnations of Canada and provincial politics and things. And therefore we have some memory of times that we're not merely more placid, but we're more civil. And at the moment, I don't know of any magic bullet to create the kinds of spaces. KCOR is doing some of it. As I've said before, with these Zoom conversations, I'm finding these Zoom conversations really helpful because it lets me really participate in KCOR for the first time since I moved back to Calgary. Because it used to be that and it may still be that the best KCOR conversations are in Ottawa and face-to-face. But if you're not in Ottawa face-to-face, then you're left out of it. But I don't know any place. And as for our universities, God bless them, I mean, I come at them with the same kind of trying to be empathetic and understanding on the one hand about their circumstances, and also wanting to say to them, for God's sake, it's still your job. In other words, I don't want to let people off the hook just because they're under a lot of pressure. But universities are under extraordinary pressure to behave like businesses. That we have had governments now since the Mulroney government. You may remember the commission. What was the name of the guy from the Yukon? Not Karen's.
Nelson Commission.
What's that?
Nelson.
Nelson Commission.
You should know that.
Yeah, Eric.
Eric Nelson. Yeah. Nielsen.
Yes,
Nielsen.
Eric Nielsen's commission, which basically said to the Mulroney government, we're investing in activity, not results. And everybody wants to be results oriented, which means that as you work that through, we've allowed the economic doctrine of efficiency to guide everything and only look at results and only look at them superficially, such as did you graduate, rather than were you actually educated. And universities have been turned into production factories for the things that the governments of the day think are important. So that Australia now is quite explicit that if you teach in the humanities, you may not get any increase in your university to help fund that regardless of students. Whereas if you teach in engineering, you will be guaranteed 50% more than you used to get. And the same is happening in Alberta. The same is happening in Ontario. Ontario is moving to a system invented in the US that supposedly is results oriented, and it's straight echo modern gobbledygook. And so we have to be sympathetic to the people who are in systems and not behaving well because they don't control the system. And we also have to say, if you can get access to any of those who are far enough up the chain, nevertheless, at your level, you actually have an obligation to set the tone of this place, whether or not the government's on your back. And if you have no capacity as a university president and a university board to resist the government, resign. Because your job is not to please the government. Your job is to lead the university.
Thanks. I actually am a governor on one of the U15 boards, so I see this up close and personal. I generally, I'm not perhaps quite that pessimistic here, Ruben, but I think it's an area rich for discussion. I think, frankly, we're seeing that increasingly the percentage of funding that comes to universities from provincial governments is dwindling, and they're having to find other sources of revenue. Philanthropy still remains a major one there. But I see some great work coming out of universities, for example, around UN Sustainable Development Goals that are trying to embrace student thinking in a very holistic view of what the world of the future looks like. And it has to bring social values to a very, very high place in that future.
I agree with you about some of the heroic efforts that are going on. I mean, that's, if that weren't true everywhere, in other words, if people weren't performing at a higher level than the system is actually designed for, we'd be in much more trouble as a culture. That the thing that is saving us is the quality of our character. But the Pierre Poilievres of the world don't appeal to us about to say, if you elect me, then I'm going to be relying on the quality of your character. If you're not willing to show up with a character that values these things, don't vote for me. Because if you vote for me, I'm going to work your ass off as a citizen. We haven't had any politician say that to us. Mike Pearson implied it, but Mike was an introvert and could only get elected in safe Liberal seats that were so far in Northern Ontario that nobody in Toronto even knew where they were.
Thank you. I'd like to call on Vic Buxton, please.
Oh, thank you. I hope you can hear me, Jane, can you? Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Listen, I had experience with the oil patch back quite a number of years ago. I was the one that regulated lead and gasoline, for example. I was the control arm, and I remember meeting with the Oil Association and them saying basically to me and the minister, they were there en masse, and basically they were looking at the fact they couldn't afford the consequences of taking lead and gasoline, regardless of the health impacts on kids. And I remember accusing them of their total focus is rate of return on investment equation, where they saw environmental protection and any other as a drawdown on that. And the pure objective was to maximize profit and nothing else. So the issue is really, how do we transition them, not just the oil patch, but such groups to a sort of framework of togetherness and shared values? And how do we get this, inject it into society in a meaningful way? I took on board your observation about forming the resistance movement. But if the resistance movement is only in Alberta, that doesn't include other people with same views and values in other parts of Canada, and then it doesn't have the same impact. You're not reaching out in a holistic and caring way. So I ask you, basically the question is, do you have any ideas of how we could create this level of togetherness that goes beyond Alberta, but seen by Albertans as other Canadians reaching out to help them with what they see as their financial problems right now?
Well, I agree with the thrust of what you're saying. One of the things that I'm comfortable with is saying that it's not just that we need to learn to talk to each other in conversation. We do need that, because without that, nothing else will happen. But we also need an understanding of the environment we're in, that we're in an extraordinarily rare time of human history when we are literally in the process, we don't know it yet, but we're literally in the process of changing our minds about the nature of reality and the nature of human persons and the significance of human persons in reality. And the last time this has happened was the emergence of modernity, which took several hundred years. In other words, it was even several hundred years before people began to understand that any transition was going on. Mm-hmm. So we've been on the process of becoming modern for 1,000 years. And we're again beginning to move out of modernity into another phase. So these conversations need both an intensity. So one of my fantasies is, let's pick a place. It could be Napanee in Ontario if you wanted Ontario. If you want a better, what to you is a better place, you pick it. I'm not going to argue with you. One of the candidates here in Alberta is a little town up the road called Canmore. I want some places of about 15,000 to become learning labs for this work. And yes, I know about we need to share it with other people and whatnot, but I want some places that are intense enough that they're actually getting several $1 million spent extra than their normal life because they're becoming a learning lab, because nobody in the world knows how you help reasonably successful modern industrial people voluntarily changing their orientation and their lifestyle enough to actually outgrow modernity and help nurture a new way of living into being. And you can't do it all at once at a Canadian scale. I've done enough work for the government of Canada to know that. But you could pick some places, and then you could begin to both have the National Film Board or other, because there's some wonderful independent filmmakers, be studying those things in a way to share. In other words, there's lots of ways that the learnings can be shared with other people who put their hand up and say, we're trying to do some of that. And it's the way networks grow. One of the things we don't have, this goes back to a systems issue. We don't have any foundation that has invested enough time and energy in this conversation to actually realize that as a foundation, they have no idea how to fund a new emerging future. Okay, that they're either historic foundations, which like the Ford Foundation or the Rockefellers, they've been in business for so damn long that in a sense, there's nothing to teach them about being a foundation, except they're a good modern foundation. And they have no idea how to fund the emergence of a world that transcends modernity. And if you look at the Gates Foundation, God bless it, it did not occur to them. They did not have the humility to say, we've got an extraordinary opportunity because we're creating the world's best funded foundation. Therefore, it actually won't make a hell of a lot of difference to the next 100 years, whether we start now and found it this year, or whether we invest the next 5 years in asking the question, what would a foundation that's committed to funding the emerging future actually look like and do and be? And they did not ask that question. And on the 10th anniversary of their foundation, Bill Gates said publicly, what I've learned is this is really hard and we've wasted a lot of money. And in one sense, I want to say, Bill, good on you for owning up to some of that. But the fact that you were blind to the wider question just absolutely, it staggers me in terms of the arrogance, particularly of males with money in senior positions. It does not occur to them that they need to seriously ask, how would I do this job if I knew what I was doing?
Well, thank you very much.
Okay, our last question or comment is coming from from Jeff Passmore.
Yeah, hi, Ruben, and thanks so much. Almost every slide you put up could have, well, it did motivate a response from me, but I don't want to focus on all those comments. I mean, the notion of Alberta separation is so absurd. If they can't get their product to market now as part of Canada, how would they get it to market as a landlocked country? But, and the First Nations comment that you made, I guess the Alberta First Nations took a page out of the Quebec First Nations book, just like the Alberta Separatists took a page out of the Quebec Separatist book, because the First Nations in Quebec said, if Quebec province separates from Canada, we're separating from Quebec because we're part of Canada. So it was the same story in Quebec. You mentioned quality of leaders. I have no idea how anybody would want to get into politics these days with how vicious social media attacks are. In fact, I really feel badly for our healthcare workers who everybody was out banging pots and pans of support in the first wave. And now all those same healthcare workers are coming under attack for, compromising our civil liberties and getting death threats. So, but my main point, and what I'm so glad you raised was, and I think that's the theme, and it follows up on what Bob said, which is you spoke about the need for relationships. And this is never going to work if we, the so-called progressives, think we're going to be able to lecture to, the Trump supporters about why they're wrong. If they are so fed up, why did 71 million people vote for Donald Trump? Because they're fed up with the conversations about whether, with progressives having an argument about parsing pronouns and whether the LGBTQ times 2 community is sufficient enough to describe the non-heterosexual humans. They really are only concerned about what that young woman spoke about, which is, do I have a job? What's my income? Can I buy a house? Can I pay my rent? Can I put food on the table? And so, yes, we have to have relationships and conversations. We cannot lecture and say we know best what's good for them. So that was the main message of yours that I thought was so key. Now, just before this webinar, this is a bit of encouragement, I was on another webinar with the Natural Resources Minister, Seamus O'Regan, where he said, and I could almost not believe what I was hearing, he was being interviewed by Anne McClellan, who of course is an Albertan and who used to be the Minister of Natural Resources back when Paul Martin was Prime Minister. And he said, and I quote, because I wrote this down, I believe in the market and a price on pollution to incent innovation. The world is watching Canada. With the incoming Biden administration, our US customer will change what it is demanding. The customer is always right. There's going to be fundamental change in the US. We need to pivot and lower our emissions. BlackRock is divesting itself of Canadian oil. We've got to skate where the puck is going. I couldn't believe that this was the Natural Resources Minister making those comments.
Yes.
Anyway, so enough. It's already almost 3:30 and I've got something else at 3:45, but I just congratulate you on your emphasis on the need for relationships and having a dialogue, not lecturing.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank all of you who've, if there's anybody else still around, or anybody who watches this, thank all those who will watch this as a video and not have an opportunity to engage.
And Ruben, I would like to say thank you very much. Your presentation was wonderful, and obviously it has stimulated an enormous amount of discussion here. As Jeff pointed out, it's an hour and a half, it's almost 2 hours now that it's been going. So wonderful, and thank you very much.